Good evening. Today we're going to be looking specifically at transitions. When I started out making music, I always felt it was really difficult to transition from one section to the next. And now I realise it's more simple than I could have ever imagined. You either create sound from one section and sew it into the next, or you create silence to make distinction from one section to the next. Today we're going to be looking at a few ways that we can do that. Let's get into it. So I'm using the track that I made for the Hybrid Minds and Goddard tune that I did a while back. So if you haven't seen that video, you can check it out there. So let's have a listen at what we've got at the moment. We've got a drop, and then we've got a second half of the drop. So at the moment our transition from one section to the next is a little bit flat. There's nothing interesting about it. It's sort of one section almost feels like it's copy and pasted onto the next, and the only difference is really this vocal. I feel like when you start out, a lot of the times the default that you go to is adding a riser and a downlifter in and out, and they're both sort of hitting on this tipping point between section A and section B. And actually there's some really interesting ways you can transition that isn't just a sweep up and a sweep down. So at the moment we've got a pretty standard sweep in and sweep out. So let's look at some ways to make that a little bit more interesting. And one of the things that has changed since I first started producing is actually removing elements before the next section. For me, when I started out, I would add a load of sweeps, a load of rises, and a load of downlifters. And actually, to get the impact of the second half is more effective when you take something out before that second half hits. So the first thing I would do when looking at a transition like this is what can we take out rather than what can we put in. So I would just take out a load of stuff and see what it sounds like. One of the most impactful things you can do is take everything out, maybe just leave the vocal in. So if we push this sweep back, so the backing track has silence in this part and there's only the vocals playing, we can see what that sounds like. So you hear removing stuff is really impactful. And what I might do as well is take out things like your reverb. So I've got a audio effects rack here. So if we take the reverb out in this section too, and the delay, so the whole of the track becomes super dry and empty in this little section. And then as we come back into this section, the reverb and the vocals come back in, and all of the elements of the backing track come back in.
Welcome home.
And then to transition even better, there's sort of infinite ways we can go about it. You can just choose to leave that gap in, and I think leaving silence is a really effective way of transitioning, but we can make it a little bit more interesting. So what I do quite a lot is put a reverse kick in. So we've got the kick that we're using here, and we just put it in on an audio track, maybe take off the click at the start, and as that comes in, it's almost acting as a sweep. And normally we have a propensity as producers to just add white noise sweeps in and out. And actually, if you use the instrumentation that is already in the track, it sounds a little bit less generic, because white noise sweeps in and out, it can feel a little bit dated. So different ways of sweeping in and out using the instrumentation that you're already using. So in this sense, the kick. So just reverse that kick.
Welcome home.
So that kick is acting as a bit of a short sweep up into the next section, and it feels a little bit more organic than a white noise riser would. And we can do a similar thing with the instruments that we're using. So for example, the stab that we've got playing, we can add a reverse stab. So if we stick a big old reverb on that stab and then create an audio track, set it to resampling and solo that, and we can record that stab. So now we have a bounce of this stab, and we just press R on the keyboard and it reverses it. We'll take that reverb off. So now we have this stab that is being reversed, and we can add a fader at the start to control when it comes in and when it comes out. Welcome home. So here what we're doing, again like the kick, we are sweeping up into our next section, but using the sounds that our ears are going to hear in that next section. So rather than it being that generic sweep noise sound, we're using the sounds that exist already in the template of our song. It feels much more natural, and the sweeps that you're creating here will always be unique to the songs that you're making, because you're creating them with the sounds that are in your track, rather than it being a sweep that you've just pulled in from a sample pack. And we can control how long or short we want this to come in. And we can do this with anything we want, so we can do it with a vocal. So let's try to do the same thing with a vocal. So I'll just make a new track, stick a big old reverb on there. It's important to listen to the tail of this reverb when you're sort of selecting the bit of audio that you're going to use. So using this little clip here, you can really hear the sound of the note. Whereas if you use maybe just the start here, it's not such a distinct sound to the tail. Whereas this little bit here, the tail is much more clean and has more of a note to it. So we do the same thing again. We create a audio track, set it to resampling, solo the track that we're going to record. And we can do the same thing again. Press R, reverse. We'll just take the initial hit off there, so we only get the reverb in there. And then same again, we might just put the fader in so it just comes in at that last little bit. And then we can do some interesting things like pitch bend it. So if we double click on that audio clip, click on envelope, clip, transposition, and we can do something like a pitch bend like this. So as a little bit of interest, we could do the opposite. So we could start 12 semitones down and then go up to the original pitch. That sounds a little bit better to me. So let me just take those vocals out so we can hear that a little bit better. So as we're producing our own sweeps into that, we can affect them in different ways as well to make them a little bit more interesting. Another thing we can do is look at the musicality of the song. And as we're going from this first section into this second section, we can see the first section is F sharp, E, D, E sharp. And then we've got a little gap here where we can musically help to bridge the gap between this E and the F sharp. So at the moment I've got this little sort of Reese fill going on here. So we can copy that over. As we're going to hit this F sharp in the next section, we can make our little Reese fill here an F sharp, and we can bend into that note. So we can add this little F sharp bridge in here so it transitions from this E to the F sharp more smoothly, and we can create a little pitch bend on this F sharp where we have a melodic transition from this E that eventually gets up to this F sharp here. So we put this F sharp in, and then let's create a little pitch bend on this F sharp. So our pitch bend is on -2 here, and that means when we put our pitch bend right down to 0, the start of our note will be 2 semitones down because we're at -2 on that pitch bend. So this will be an E, and then it will slowly transition into the F sharp once it reaches this 0.5 here. So you can hear it's a natural glide from that E into the F sharp. And then we can add some more little bits of interest like reverbs. So I'm just going to use this endless smile to make it easy. We can add a little bit of endless smile, and you can just use a reverb for this. So you can put reverb on and do the same automation with the dry wet. So the cutoff opens up as we're going into that next section and creates a bit of a swell. So there's an increase of the space as we go from this empty section, the reverb increases and then ducts out as we go into this next section. So I've just got this little drum break here that I've just found, and we can manipulate that to ease ourselves into the next transition as well.
Welcome.
So it's a little bit boring at the moment. We can maybe do a few little bits of stutter in there. Something like that. Which helps us ease us in as well. Or we could just put a straight armor break in there. And we can cut that up as well a little bit. So it all depends on what the song wants, effectively. You can mess about with these kind of things forever and ever. There's not necessarily a right way of doing it. But the thing I would always tend to do is, as we've done, use sort of reverses from the sounds that we're already using, and then add bits of silence. And then with drums particularly, I think it's a good idea to use different drums in these little break sections or for your fills, just to make it feel a little bit more interesting. So you have a distinct change between the drums that you've got throughout this drop here. Then you have a different change up of drums in your transition, and then you return back to your original drums. And something we can do to the white noise sweeps, if we do want to use those to make them a little bit more interesting, is we can stick on auto pan, automate the amount to go up to 100%, and then we automate the rate to change as time goes on. So let's put that all the way up. And now we can hear there's a little bit of movement in that sweep, rather than it just being this straight static sweep that we had before. Now with that just simple little bit of automation, it just gives it a little bit of movement and makes it a little bit more interesting. And you can use these techniques on any transition you have. A lot of times I've always felt it's difficult to transition from your drop into the second verse. These same things apply. I would do the same thing, create little bits of silence just before the end of your drop. You can add a drum fill, add reverses. If you've got different instruments in your next section, it's always a good idea to add these reverb reverses in your next section just before the drop, so your ears are slowly getting introduced to the sound of the next section before it actually hits. So there are little ways that you're teasing the sound of the next section, or a particular sound of the next section, actually before it comes in. And in that way you blend the transition much easier from one particular sound, like a drop, to another section if there are different types of sounds, different types of instruments playing in that next section. And those are the fundamental things I would experiment with. Silence, I would say, is the greatest thing that I've found that helps you transition. Taking things out will always help the transition much more than adding things in. And then once you've taken out what needs to be taken out, then you add little teasers of what's going to come next just before that transition to sonically smooth its way into that next section. If you've got any other good ideas of how to transition, do let me know in the comments. Thank you very much. Love to your mothers. Thank you.